Creating a new product from the ground up in an established segment can go one of three ways. Number one, the product is so good that it sets a benchmark for what the product in this segment should be. Number two is that the product is just not good enough. It doesn't cut the market needs and it stands as a benchmark of what other manufacturers shouldn't do. And number three is that the product just doesn't do enough. It doesn't excite the customers and it just fades away into the sea of other products that already exist in an overpopulated segment. Now, what I have with me today is the Bajaj Freedom 125, the world's first CNG motorcycle. And with this bike, Bajaj aims to revolutionize the commuters segment. Have they managed to do that though? That's exactly what I'm here to find out. Welcome to our first ride review of the Bajaj Freedom 125. But before we proceed, don't forget to like and share this video and smash that bell icon to stay notified for all of our video drops. Now with the Freedom 125, Bajaj has decided to break away from the mold of a traditional plain Jane looking commuter and instead have taken a more aesthetic, more sporty approach to the design of this motorcycle. It still is a commuter after all, but it doesn't look nearly as boring. I do quite like how this bike looks. It's sharp, it's sporty looking without being too aggressive and in your face. You have this nice roundish headlight with this surround metal beam around it. You have a nice large tank, you have an exposed trolley frame, you have this nice long seat. Now Bajaj claims that this is the longest in the segment at 750 mm. You have these funky graphics on the tank, these plates over here. The top end variant, it also gets that bash plate over there, and everything that you see on this motorcycle is built to a purpose, and that purpose is to accommodate the rather large CNG tank. Now if I open the seat, you will see that you have a tank that extends nearly the length of the entire body of the motorcycle. So because of that, Bajaj has had to make a lot of tough calls and choose the right componentry to make sure that you have a nice handling motorcycle. It rides well, but it also doesn't become obnoxiously large. So to that end, I think they've done a really good job. So you have a trolley frame because you couldn't otherwise use a twin beam or a twin spar frame, because then there'd be no space for the CNG tank. Just like that, you have a link type monoshock, not because they're trying to make this the sportiest bike out there, but because there wasn't enough space to have a traditional shock absorber setup or even a monoshock for that matter. That's why they had to choose a link type suspension. Now if you look at the rear, there's also a 16-inch wheel and not a 17-inch wheel, and that has been done to make sure that the ride is taken care of, because a 17-inch wheel with the lack of space over here would have hampered with ride quality a fair bit. So all in all, I feel like Bajaj has done a really smart job of packaging this motorcycle really well while making it look youthful, appealing to a larger audience, but also sticking to a core commuter DNA. Now before I get into the performance of this motorcycle, let me tell you briefly how it works. So this essentially is an engine that is capable of bi-fuels. So essentially you have a CNG tank that also provides CNG to the engine for combustion, and when you so choose to, you can also use the 2-liter petrol tank for running the motorcycle. But Bajaj is selling this as a CNG bike, and what they are using this petrol tank for is essentially a limp home mode feature. So when you run out of CNG is when Bajaj wants you to use the petrol tank of this motorcycle. Now this engine, it's a ground up engine. That is what Bajaj tells us, and that does make sense, because if they were to convert any other 125cc engine, that's a lot of work and a lot of R&D to make sure that that bike and that engine can handle all the stresses and the load that CNG adds to the mix, because CNG is a lot more combustible, it's a lot more corrosive, and it does a lot more damage to the engine, so to speak. Now to that end, this engine has separate injectors for the petrol and separate injectors for CNG as well. And Bajaj also tells us that this has a smart system where even when you're running it on CNG, every now and then, every few ignition cycles, the petrol fuel injector will also work to make sure that the petrol system is primed and ready to go if you want to choose, because this does have a switch where you can change from CNG to petrol on the fly, and it happens, you just blip the throttle when you're riding, switch the mode, and it switches almost instantaneously. Now in terms of performance, this 125cc engine is good for 9.3 bhp and 9.7 newton meters of torque. Now those figures, they do sound modest in front of other 125cc bikes, which usually have a power figure in the ballpark of 11 to 12 bhp, but that is to be expected because CNG does usually take away some of the performance from the table. That being said, when I started riding this bike, I was anticipating a rather vibey, a rather agricultural feeling motorcycle, but this is anything but that. This is a very refined motor. It feels very smooth throughout the rev range. Now this doesn't have a tachometer, so I can't tell you exactly where in the rev range the vibes are introduced, but it's mostly very very close to the rev ceiling. So that's a good thing, because there's not much performance to be had when you're really revving the motorcycle. So to that end, the riding experience is one of a lot of refinement, and that is really surprising, and it's commendable that Bajaj has managed to do that. In terms of performance, from CNG to petrol, there's not much performance difference. Bajaj claims the same power figures for both. In fact, they weren't telling us any power figures for if you were running the bike on petrol, so they're saying that it's very, very similar. And in terms of feel, it does feel very close. The only noticeable difference that I feel when I switch it from CNG to petrol is that the engine feels a tad bit more eager to rev when you're on petrol mode, but the effect on performance seems negligible at best. Now this engine is mated to a 5-speed gearbox. It's very tractable. You can carry lower speeds at higher gears. Now you are dealing with very little power and torque, so don't expect a lot of performance, but what it does have, it does spread out very nicely across the rev range. You can carry a gear or two higher than you should be, and overall the riding experience is very mellow, very chill. The clutch action is very light, the gear shifts are slick and solid. All in all, a very nice and a very refined riding experience. Now whether or not this does stand the test of time, whether or not the use of CNG will corrode the parts faster, and if reliability will be an issue, is only something time will tell. But my initial impressions are that this is a solid motorcycle. Performance feels comparable to a 100 to 110cc motorcycle, and yeah, ride it in CNG all day long and it's a good time. Now the fact that this runs on CNG is all well and good, but the harsh reality is that we just don't have a well-developed enough CNG network to make it the only viable running fuel for this motorcycle. Now to that end, Bajaj has given this a supplementary 2-liter fuel tank, but in my opinion that just doesn't cut it, because if there are going to be days where you don't have access to a CNG pump, or the line just expands too long for you to want to wait in that queue, I feel like 2 liters is too less to get by. A day max is all the usage that you will get out of it. A 5-liter tank would have been more realistic and would have made this bike easier to live with if you didn't have access to CNG. Now in terms of the efficiency figures that Bajaj quotes, you get around 102 kilometers per kilogram of CNG, and you get 65 kilometers to the liter on this fuel tank with this engine. Now that might sound like enough, but you also have to bear in mind that pressures at different CNG pumps do vary. So if you're not getting the right amount of pressure, you won't be able to fill up the tank completely, which is why I circle back to the fact that a bigger fuel tank would have made living with this bike that much easier. Now let's talk about the ride and handling and the ergonomic setup of this motorcycle. This, after all, is a 125cc motorcycle, but it's a little bit confusing. If you look at it from far, it looks much smaller than it actually is. But when you're sitting on it, it feels a little more substantial than a 125cc motorcycle, and that's primarily because of the CNG tank that's running down the spine of the motorcycle, and because of that they've had to place the fuel tank around. So it does feel a little wider from the rider's triangle point of view. Now talking about the rider's triangle, you're seated on this really nice long seat. The foot pegs are mid-mounted, so it's not rear set, not too forward. Again, very comfortable. You can reach down very comfortably even if you're on the shorter side, because again, the bike is very narrow, especially where you're sitting. So getting your feet down shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. And you're reaching out to a fairly wide handlebar. And as you can see, there's a nice comfortable bend in my arm, so I'm not stretching out for it, which again should mean that shorter riders shouldn't be struggling too much on it either. Now talking about the chassis setup, this is where things get really interesting. Now like I said before, accommodating for that CNG tank has been one of the primary challenges that Bajaj has faced, and to that end they've engineered a pretty smart solution for this motorcycle. Now they're using a trolley frame for the bike, not something you see in this segment of motorcycle, but that's purely because of the fact that you want something that is safe, that handles well, and most importantly can safeguard the CNG tank in the case of an accident. Now Bajaj tells us that they have done as many as 11 crash and impact tests to make sure that the tank stays safe, and I'm going to take their word for it. I don't want to go and crash this bike and find out for myself, so let's assume that that is the case. Now this bike, it is suspended off of a telescopic fork setup at the front and a monoshock at the rear, and the eagle-eyed among you would have noticed that this isn't a traditional monoshock. This is a link type monoshock. Again, because of the packaging constraints, Bajaj has had to engineer a clever solution and use things that would otherwise sit in a segment above. Now what you get in return is a very nice plush ride and handling setup, and this is despite the 16-inch wheel at the rear, which again is a result of packaging constraints. You don't really feel like it's too small or it is getting caught by the undulations on the road, and even the entire suspension setup is on the plusher side of things. The more weight you put on it, the more it settles down, and again, you're never really going fast enough to really work the suspension that much. In terms of braking, this is the top end variant, so you do get the disc brake at the front and a drum brake at the rear. Braking performance is solid, you have enough bite, but one thing I would have liked is that for the brake lever to be slightly softer. It feels really stiff right now. This is something that running in might solve, but I've not ridden the bike for long enough, so I can't comment on that just yet. But as it stands, the braking performance is there. I would just have liked if the travel of the brake lever was a little softer to access. In terms of handling, you do get a 17-inch wheel up front, and this is a light motorcycle, not light by the segment standard. This is 147 kilos. That weight penalty again comes courtesy of the CNG tank and all the extra stuff that Bajaj has had to put on the motorcycle, but it doesn't feel too bothersome. It does feel a little heavier when you're maneuvering it in a parking lot, but the second you get going, it's very comfortable, it's very agile, it turns direction very quickly, and it is predictable in the corners as well. This is not what I would recommend for going and carving out your twisties on the weekend, but it will get by for sure. Now, in terms of features, this isn't as bare bones as you would think. This is the top end variant, and it does get Bluetooth connectivity for call control. You also have a dedicated button over here. Now, other convenience features include the fact that the CNG filler is right here next to the fuel filler, so you don't need to undo any other panels or take off your seat for that matter. Now, let's talk about the price of this motorcycle. 95,000 is the entry point into the range of the Freedom 125, and that will get you a regular halogen bulb and a drum brake at the front. At 1,05,000 ex-showroom, you have a LED headlight variant but no disc brake at the front, and this is the top end variant at rupees 1.1 lakh ex showroom, and that benefits from the Bluetooth connectivity, a disc brake at the front and an LED headlight. Now, this does seem like a pricey proposition, especially when you factor in that this is after all a 125cc commuter, but like you do have with EVs, you're paying a little more upfront and you will make that money back as and when you use the bike. But then again, there's a caveat over there. The returns are only when you're using CNG, and CNG is going to be difficult to fill until the network and the infrastructure for filling CNG really widens up a lot more. Another thing that I feel like is a bit of a miss is the fact that this top end variant doesn't get ABS, at least single channel front ABS. At this price, I feel like single channel ABS should have been included in this motorcycle, or at least buyers should have the option to buy it if they want to. But talking about the bike itself, I feel like this is a stellar attempt from Bajaj to capture a whole new audience and to also set commuter bikes rolling on a whole different path. EVs are not the be all and end all of everything, and I like that Bajaj has tried something different. Yes, the CNG network is not as widespread as it should be, but it's just a matter of time before manufacturers start taking notice of this fact and start building up on the CNG network. CNG also means lesser emissions, so there's also a win on that front. In terms of the riding experience, Bajaj has done a very good job of making this feel as traditional as possible without really making you feel like you're driving or riding something of an alternate fuel type. And that, I feel, will just make a lot more people more accepting of this motorcycle. It's refined, it's smooth, it's comfortable, it's plush, it ticks all the boxes you want from a commuter, and it also looks like this, which may be a good thing for some people, which may not be a good thing for some people. But then again, that's very subjective. As a bike, I feel like Bajaj has done a great job with this motorcycle, but I'm really curious to know what you think about it. So do let me know about it in the comment section down below, and as always, thank you for watching.